It's a great privilege and a great honor to talk with Margaret MacMillan, the extraordinary author of an excellent book, The War, How Conflicts Shaped Us. Thank you very much for accepting this interview, Margaret MacMillan. It's a great honor to have this discussion.
Well, it's a great honor and pleasure to talk to you as well, so thank you.
My first question is this one. Why can't we avoid serious reflection about war? Why it is not good to try to avoid such reflection about the war?
Well, I think if we don't look at things that are unpleasant, then we allow them to go on and we allow them to flourish. And sadly, and I don't need to tell you in Romania because you're so close to a war at the moment, war is very much with us. It has been somewhere in the world ever since 1945. There has been a war, there has been war. We have a number of wars going on at the moment. We have the potential for war. And so I think we need to examine it. We need to know about it, if only, and this is very important, so we can get some idea of how we might stop it or how we might prevent it. I don't think we should study it just because we like the glory of war. I think we should study war because it is something that affects human beings deeply, and we should do our best to try and avoid it.
Mm-hmm. Your historical work, historical profile with the topic of war at its center is really impressive. What do we tend to forget all too easily about war?
Once the war is over, I think we're often so relieved that it's over that we don't want to think about it anymore. And I think what we can forget is how wars can be created. And they can be created by political movements, ideological movements. They can be created, I think, by individuals. And war is not something that just happens. It happens because enough people want it to happen. And we shouldn't forget the possibility of war is always there. And sometimes, very sadly, wars happen by accident. I myself would argue that the First World War in 1914, when it broke out, was the result of a series of accidents and miscalculations. We can, I'm afraid, stumble into war without really intending it, without really thinking it will go that far. I suspect even in the case of the war in Ukraine today, President Putin thought that he would be able to overawe and overpower Ukraine, that Ukrainians wouldn't fight. And he made a dreadful miscalculation, which the Ukrainians and indeed the Russian people are paying for.
Mm-hmm. Actually, why is war, and now it's a quote, an essential component of humanity, as you said?
War runs through so much of human history, and it may be, we don't know and we may never know, that before we settled down and became agriculturalists, before we became farmers, that we lived in a sort of harmony. We were nomadic peoples. I don't think we'll probably ever know that, although there's some evidence that even nomadic peoples, even peoples who moved around with their animals, fought each other. But as far as we know in recorded history, once we begin getting the records, war was very much a feature of human society. And it's played a very important part in shaping human societies. So many of our institutions, our ideas, the ways we do things were shaped by war. And so I would see it not as something that is separate from human society, but something that is intertwined with human society and has had a very deep impact on it.
Mm-hmm. In other words, is our nature as a human being a warlike one?
You've asked about a big debate that goes on and on and on. And I come somewhere in the middle, I think. As a good Canadian, we like to come in the middle. But I think we have, we certainly are creatures. We, in some ways, animals, and we have certain instincts which we have developed over the millennia. Evolutionary processes have given us certain instincts, and we can be aggressive. We can often be aggressive when we're frightened, but we can also be kind, we can be altruistic, we can think of others, we can work with others. So I don't think these characteristics add up to a single human nature. I think we have contradictory impulses, And I don't think we're doomed to fight. And we have many examples of societies that were once very warlike, which are no longer warlike. Sweden, for example, was a very militarized society up until the 18th century. And you look at Sweden today, it's a very different sort of society. And so my own view, as I say, this is a debate that goes on and on. My own view is that culture plays a very important part, that we are conditioned to behave in certain ways. And when you think of what happens in war, a lot of what happens in war is people doing things that really go against human nature. Why would you want to go and get yourself killed? Why would you want to put yourself at risk? And so I think culture plays a very important part in conditioning people towards or against war.
Mhm. What toxic biases, perspective do we have about wars? Behind what big biases are we hiding from this very important topic as is the war, is the topic of war?
I think one of the biases about war is that it's glorious, that it's something that's noble, that it's the highest form of human activity. And we've seen that in various societies throughout history. In Sparta, for example, in ancient Greece, it was considered the right thing to do for young men, to be trained as warriors and be prepared to die and be prepared to kill others. And we've seen it more recently in societies like Prussia, where the Junker class, the landed class, brought its young up to think that war was the most noble of occupations. And so I think that can be a very important bias. And I think we too often glamorize war, too often in television series or movies, not always, but too often we show war as something that's heroic, that doesn't hurt, that doesn't have terrible penalties. And I think these things make us treat war too lightly. The other bias I think we sometimes have is to think that if we don't look at war, it will somehow go away. That if we don't think about it, it's not going to happen. And that I think is very foolish.
Mm-hmm. Researching about the war is not the same as endorsing it, isn't it?
I agree with you. Occasionally I get accused of being someone who likes war because I think about it and study it, and I don't.
Mm.
And I think you wouldn't say of people who study injustices in the past, who study serfdom or slavery, or who study racial discrimination of any sort, you wouldn't say they like it. They are doing it to try and understand something that has been a feature far too often of human societies. And I feel the same about studying war. I think it is such an important factor in moving human history, in determining human history, in shaping human societies, in affecting individuals, thousands, millions of individuals, that we have to try and understand it and study it.
What is peace, not only in theory, but in practice and related to war, to the war? Can we say that somehow peace is a nonsense in this, let's say, in this frame related with the topic of the war?
We must never say something is impossible, in my view, because then we simply give up trying. And we know that we can be peaceful. We know that it is possible for former enemies to come to terms. And when you think of what's happened in Europe since 1945, no one, I think, or very few people in 1945 would have believed that the French and the Germans, or the Germans and the British, or the Germans and many of their enemies could work together, and that Germany could become a peaceful country. And that's what we have to remember, that human beings change, and it is quite possible to change. And I think for a lot of us, if you ask most people, would they rather live in a state of war or a state of peace? They'd rather live in a state of peace. That it is something that most human beings would prefer. And we are capable of achieving peace. The trouble is we always have to be wary or look out for those who want to make war.
Mm-hmm. How exactly is our world shaped by war? Do we live actually in a world configured, shaped by war?
Well, yes, we do live in a world shaped by war. The borders of the countries we live in have often been shaped by war. Romania's borders were shaped in part by the First and Second World Wars, and they would have been different without those two wars. And so the very states in which we live, I think the shape of those states has been created by war often, not always. Government, strong central government in Europe certainly grew as a result of the need to make war and to tax citizens, to try and bring people into the war effort. In some ways, war has stimulated some of the advances which we've benefited from in peacetime. Now, this is not the way we would choose to do it, because wars are incredibly expensive and wasteful, but some of the things that have happened in science and technology, in medicine, are a result of developments in war. Nuclear power is a result of the huge research effort that was put into making the bomb by the Allies in the Second World War. And that knowledge has had peacetime applications. And so wars can produce advances in organization and societies, in the improvement often of the position of people in society, improvements in the position of women, for example, or the working classes, because they have contributed to the war effort and it's been seen necessary to treat them better. And so war can be an agent of social change, of progress. As I say, we wouldn't choose war in order to achieve these things, but sometimes that's a side effect.
Mhm. There is no doubt that wars have shaped us. The subtitle of one of your book, actually this one, is How Conflicts Shaped Us. But have wars also mutilate us? Did they, wars, kill important sequences of humanity?
Yes, wars do damage us. They do awful things often, and they often will leave societies that are more authoritarian, less tolerant, with a warrior class in control. And so by no means are the outcomes of wars always beneficial. What it really is something that is very mixed. You can point to some things that have come out of wars that have been beneficial. You can also point to other things. And we must never forget the sheer destructive power of war, which has increased very, very fast in the past 2 or 3 centuries. Unfortunately, as we have become more technologically advanced, we've also become a lot better at destruction. And you think of the costs of war. Again, looking at pictures from Ukraine, I think we're getting a very good idea of what can happen to a modern city with modern weapons. It can literally be leveled to the ground. They could be turned into rubble. And always, in wars, particularly the longer they go on and the more savage they are, it is the civilians, the innocent, who pay a price. It's the women, it's the old men, it's the men, it's the children, it's the people who aren't fighting themselves, but who are often the targets of war, the victims of war. And it's very hard to calculate what the costs of that are. But people who've been through wars often bear psychological and physical scars for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm. The motto of the introduction to the book about war, How Conflicts Have Shaped Us, is from a text by Svetlana Alexievich entitled War Has No Female Face. Can we deduce from this that it has a man's face? The war is with man's face?
It's such an interesting question, and I think what we can say is, looking through history, most of those who have fought have been men. You know, the great majority of those who've actually fought and got killed and tried to kill others in combat have been men. There are a few examples of women fighting, but very few, so they stand out. Having said that, women have often participated in wars by encouraging the men to fight, by pushing for war. Some of the most warlike leaders in history have been women. Maria Theresa of Austria, Catherine the Great of Russia, they presided over very big wars. And so I think, yes, war has been a largely masculine endeavor, but women have been involved in a number of ways. Of course, they've often been its victims. Women have been regarded as prizes of war. They've been carried off as slaves. They've been raped. They've been killed as a consequence of war. And so women's involvement in war is on many levels, but I think they're affected by war as much as men are, perhaps often in different ways.
Mm-hmm. When are wars good for people? When do they have anything positive, if we can say this?
Those who fight wars fight them for a number of reasons, but I think a fundamental reason often in war is simply to survive. And so your people are under threat, your community is under threat, your society is under threat. And what choice do you have? In some cases, you are better fighting because at least you have some hope that you might succeed than acquiescing. You think of the sorts of regimes that Europe has seen so much of in the 20th century. And I can understand why people such as the Poles in the Second World War decided they were better off fighting Nazi Germany than submitting to it. Because whatever happened to them, Nazi Germany was going to treat them badly. And fighting at least gave them some hope of survival. And so war can help people to survive. It can give cohesiveness to peoples. I think, again, we're seeing this in Ukraine, a society which was a modernizing society, a democratizing society, which had many divisions, as all societies do. But what the war has done, I think, is deepen a sense of Ukrainian nationalism and solidarity. Ukrainians are now working with each other in ways that perhaps they couldn't and weren't able to in peacetime. And so what wars can do, I think, is help peoples to survive, and sometimes they will survive. What it can also do, and people who've been through wars say this, it can also give a great sense of solidarity and community. And there is a study, much debated now, by the German sociologist Emil Durkheim, who argued, and I think it's an interesting study, even though its results have been challenged, he argues that suicides go down in wars because people feel that they have part of something and that they're important. And what people have often said, and I think it's a good question, is why can't we do that in peacetime? Why can't we get peoples working together for common good, for example, to deal with climate change in peacetime, as they often will work together in a war?
Mm-hmm. You wrote also about the war as a big organizer. Is war really one of the most organized human activities, maybe even the most organized? And if so, is the war a model of good practice in this sense?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a model of good practice, but there are you know, when you think of war, it is, I mean, you said it's the most organized of human activities, and I would agree with that. When you think of the organization needed, first of all, to turn people into warriors, because, you know, we're not all natural-born soldiers or sailors. It often takes a great deal of training and organization to even produce someone who's going to obey orders and be prepared to do the sorts of things you have to do in war. It takes a huge amount of organization to give those people weapons. It takes a huge amount of organization to make sure they have the right ammunition. It takes all sorts of organization to make sure they get to the right place at the right time. I mean, logistically, the sheer amount of organization needed in war, particularly modern war, I think is absolutely huge. And if you look at modern armies, more and more, the proportion of those fighting is dwarfed, is less, much less than the proportion of those behind the lines supporting them. Because to keep, it's like keeping a car racer in a car race or an athlete at the Olympics. It takes a huge team to keep them there. And so I think war is something that's highly organized, and often, again, methods learned in war, a cost-benefit analysis, for example, was something, with the whole notion of how much something is costing you and is it worth doing? Are you getting enough benefit? Is something that was pioneered in the Second World War by Americans, for example, American business experts looking at the use of American bombers. You know, was the American government spending its money in the right way by building these very expensive bombers? Was it getting enough benefit out of it? And so the methods learned in war and the organization learned in war, again, have often filtered through and made a difference to civilian societies.
Mm-hmm. Why we fear war is easy to understand, but why are we still so fascinated by war?
It's an old question, and I think it's partly because we see people doing appalling things, and we see people doing very noble things in war. I think war brings out the worst and the best in human characters, and I think we often admire those who are prepared to sacrifice themselves for others. You know, a soldier who will throw himself on a hand grenade to save other people in his unit. I mean, we find it hard to imagine someone could be so brave and so noble as that. And so I think the qualities that war brings out are something that fascinate us. And I find for myself, when I study war, I say to myself, could I have done that? could I have been so brave? Could I have gone into battle? And the answer, of course, in my case is probably not. But you do wonder about what brings people to these actions, to these ways of thinking. I think the other thing about war is that, and people who fought in wars, and every war is different, but people who fought in wars have said that there is often a sense of friendship, a deep friendship that you don't get in many other situations because you depend on each other. And you know that the person beside you will die for you and you'll die for them. And with very few exceptions, we don't get that in civilian life. I think those who fight fires probably have something of that feeling because they depend on each other. Fishermen perhaps have that sense of feeling because they have to help each other when they're at sea. But I think most of us never really encounter that. And I think that's one of the fascinations of war. What is it like to be in a situation where you actually feel you can depend on those around you to the point of death?
Mm-hmm. Two last questions. Your first two books translated into Romania are about the Great War and its direct consequences. The war that ended peace and peacemakers. Can we repeat, or indeed we are repeating, the great bitter lessons of the Great War now in recent decades? It's like a fatality to repeat the lessons which we do not learn.
We don't always learn, do we? And that's, I think, because when something awful is over or something momentous is over, we want to look ahead. We want to forget about it. And I think what went wrong after the First World War is that too many states were set up on the ethnic principle, which led to all sorts of conflict, particularly in the center of Europe, and that Germany was not brought back into the community of nations early enough, perhaps, that there wasn't enough international cooperation to try and deal with crises as they came along. Those who made peace after the Second World War were very conscious of that, which is why they set up the United Nations, why gradually both Germany and Japan were brought back into the community of nations. And how you end a war is very difficult, and the desire is for revenge, but what you need to be doing is thinking of the peace and what comes.
This is the last question. You write like this, it's a quote, "Now, war is not an aberration that we must forget as quickly as possible." I finished the quote. Why isn't it? Why isn't it an aberration, in your sense?
We tend to look at war as something that comes like a thunderstorm out of a clear sky. It's something horrible, then it's over. We don't have to think about it again. And we know with thunderstorms that there are reasons why they happen. And they don't just come out of a clear blue sky. They develop over time, the weather system builds up, and then you get lightning and thunder. And I think it's the same with war, that we have to always be aware of it. And we have to be aware of it potentially in our own societies. I think too many of us who lived in the West since 1945 in what people have called the Great Peace have forgotten that war is something that continues, and the potential, the possibility for war is always there. I think very few people would have expected to see another major war in Europe 2 years ago, or even a year ago. And now we have a war in Ukraine, which I think has been shocking. But perhaps we should have been looking more carefully at that potential for war. It's there in human societies. And sometimes, without meaning to, we can slide into war.
War, How Conflicts Have Shaped Us. It's an extraordinary book. All the books of Margaret MacMillan are extraordinary. Thank you very much for the privilege of this amazing conversation. It was a very big joy for me to have this conversation.
Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for such interesting questions.